They are called elder orphans. An estimated 22% of seniors in America are aging alone, with no family to care for them. For David Thorne, a man with a $15 million trust fund, solving his own loneliness meant a simple transaction: adopting a child. He walked into the St. Francis Orphanage to find a son. But in the forgotten elderly wing, he would find the one person he never paid to see: his own mother, alive and abandoned there for 20 years. David Thorne was a man who solved every problem with a check. His wealth was a fortress against a painful past, built after he accepted his mother's death 2 decades ago. But St. Francis wasn't just an orphanage for children. It was a last resort for society's discarded elderly, a place where the forgotten went to vanish. This is the story of a son who went looking for a family to create, and instead found the one he was told had been destroyed. A discovery that would force a single, unbearable question: who left her there to die? The official story was a tragic accident, a house fire in the winter of 1999. David was 24, living in another city, building the first of many fortunes. His father, Arthur, a stern and distant man, made the call. His mother, Evelyn, was gone. The funeral was closed casket. Too damaged, his father said. David inherited a portion of the family's manufacturing wealth, a $15 million trust fund that became the seed of his own empire. He built a life on that absence, using work as anesthesia. He never married. Connections felt like liabilities, but by his mid-40s, the silence in his penthouse had become a physical weight. The solution to a man like David was logical, not emotional. He would adopt, provide a child with every advantage he could buy, and in return, perhaps fill the hollow space his own childhood had left. He selected St. Francis for its reputation. Not as a charity, but as a well-oiled institution. Efficient, discreet. His lawyer had vetted it. The paperwork was pristine. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, expecting to be shown a lineup of grateful, photogenic children. He was met instead by Sister Agnes, the administrator. She was in her 60s, with a face that looked carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. She spoke of protocols, of bonding periods, of psychological evaluations. David nodded, writing a check for $50,000 on the spot as a donation to facilitate the process. Sister Agnes accepted it without a smile, her fingers cold as they brushed his. The tour began in the children's wing. It was bright, clean, almost sterile. The children were quiet, too quiet, their eyes following the wealthy stranger with a mixture of hope and fear. David felt a pang of unease, a sense of performing in a play where he didn't know his lines. As they walked, a distant sound echoed down a connecting hallway, a long, lonely cough, the kind that comes from aged lungs. David paused. "What's down there?" Sister Agnes's step faltered for a fraction of a second. "The geriatric wing, a separate charity, a necessary service, but not for your purposes, Mr. Thorne. Our focus is the children." She gestured him forward, her voice tightening. But David was a man who had built his career on noticing what people tried to hide. The shift in her posture was a red flag in a sea of gray. He let her lead him to a sunny playroom, where a boy of about 7 was building a tower of blocks alone. "This is Leo," Sister Agnes said. "He's been with us for 3 years, a bright boy." David knelt, asking Leo about his tower. The boy whispered a one-word answer, never making eye contact. And again, from somewhere deep in the building, a muffled voice called out. A woman's voice, thin and reedy, asking for a glass of water. No one answered. David stood. "Don't you have staff for that wing?" Sister Agnes's smile was thin. "Of course, but resources are stretched, always stretched. Now shall we discuss the next steps for Leo?" David's phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer, background check on St. Francis complete. Clean financials, one note, their charter from the city includes a provision for mixed care facilities since 1985. They can house dependent adults, odd for an orphanage but legal. Mixed care facilities, the phrase stuck in his mind. He ended the tour, promising Sister Agnes he would return the next day to begin the bonding sessions with Leo. But as he drove away, his mind wasn't on the quiet boy. It was on the cough, the unanswered call for water, and the administrator's nervous eyes. That night he couldn't sleep. He pulled every public record he could find on St. Francis. The city charter, old zoning permits. Faded newspaper article from 1998, a feel-good piece about the orphanage expanding to serve all of God's forgotten children. The photograph showed a much younger Sister Agnes cutting a ribbon. In the blurred background, standing near the building's old wing, was a figure that made David's breath catch. A woman in a simple dress, her face turned away, but the slope of her shoulders, the way she held her head, it was a ghost of a memory. His mother had volunteered at charities. She loved children. Could she have volunteered here? Before the fire, he dismissed it as paranoia, the grief he thought he'd buried playing tricks. But the next morning, he returned to St. Francis with a new determination. He told Sister Agnes he wanted to see the entire campus, to understand the full scope of the charity he was investing in. She protested, citing privacy and dignity. David simply wrote another check. This one was for $25,000. For the geriatric wing, he said. Her resistance crumbled under the weight of the money. The door to the east wing was heavy, its paint peeling. The air that washed over them was different, antiseptic undercut with the sour scent of boiled cabbage and urine. The hallway was dim, the linoleum cracked. Doors stood open to small rooms, each holding a single bed, a chair, a lifetime reduced to a few square feet. Some residents stared blankly at walls. One elderly man slowly rocked back and forth in his chair. They passed a nurse's station. It was empty, a clipboard lay abandoned. David's heart hammered against his ribs. This was not a care facility. This was a warehouse. Sister Agnes walked briskly, her heels clicking, a false cheer in her voice as she greeted passing residents by the wrong names. "Hello, Margaret, looking well, George." They never responded. At the end of the hall was a sunroom. The glass was dirty, but light streamed in, illuminating particles of dust floating in the air. And there, in a wheelchair by the window, was a woman. Her hair was thin and white, her body frail under a faded pink housecoat. She was staring out at a barren courtyard, but her profile, the line of her nose, the curve of her ear, time fell away. The 44-year-old man vanished, and in his place was a 10-year-old boy being tucked into bed by a woman who smelled of lavender and honey, a woman who sang off-key lullabies, a woman whose face was the definition of safety. His feet moved before his mind could command them. He stepped into the sunroom. The floorboard creaked. The woman in the wheelchair slowly turned her head. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts, found his. They widened. A tremor passed through her. Her lips, chapped and dry, parted, and she whispered a name, not David, his childhood nickname, one only she had ever used, a sound he hadn't heard in 20 years. In that instant, the world he knew cracked open. Sister Agnes rushed forward, her hand gripping his arm. "Mr. Thorne, you mustn't disturb the residents. They're often confused." David shook her off, his gaze locked on his mother's face. He saw it now, not confusion, but a dawning, painful recognition, and beneath that, a deep, abiding fear. He turned to Sister Agnes, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Confused? Sister, this woman, what is her name?" Sister Agnes paled. She looked from David's devastated face to Evelyn's trembling hand, now reaching out toward her son. The administrator's mask of pious control finally shattered, revealing pure, unadulterated panic. "Her name is Evelyn," Sister Agnes whispered, the words escaping like a confession. "Evelyn Smith. She was transferred to us from county care years ago." David didn't hear the rest. He was on his knees, his hands covering his mother's, feeling the paper-thin skin, the prominent bones. "Mom," he said, the word strange and rusty on his tongue. Her eyes filled with tears that traced paths through the fine wrinkles on her cheeks. She tried to speak, but only a weak, rasping sound emerged. Sister Agnes moved to intervene again. "Mr. Thorne, I must insist. You will get me every record you have on this woman," David said, not looking up, his voice cold and absolute. "Every admission form, every medical chart, every financial ledger. You will get them now, or my next call is to the State Attorney General's office, and I will read them the endorsement on this $75,000 check you just deposited." The administrator fled. In her absence, the silence of the sunroom was deafening. David looked around, truly seeing it for the first time. The wheelchair was old, its brakes loose. The housecoat was threadbare. On a small side table sat a plastic cup of water and a single framed photograph. David picked it up. It was a picture of himself, age 10, holding a little league trophy. His mother had kept it on her dresser, a dresser that had supposedly burned to ashes. He turned it over. On the back, in his mother's elegant cursive, was written, "My David, always." The pieces of a 20-year lie began to assemble themselves in his mind, each one sharper than the last. Sister Agnes returned, her arms laden with a single thin file folder. She placed it on a table, refusing to meet his eye. "This is all we have. She came to us as a ward of the state, no next of kin, no assets." David opened the folder. The first page was an admission form from the County Social Services Department, dated March 3, 2001, 2 years after the fire. The listed reason for placement: severe cognitive decline, no family support. The emergency contact was blank, but in the box for referring physician was a name that sent a jolt through him: Dr. Robert Vance, his father's personal doctor. David's hands began to shake. He flipped through the sparse pages. Monthly care notes, each one nearly identical, resident stable, non-communicative, medication logs for sedatives, and then a single legal document, a power of attorney signed by Arthur Thorne relinquishing all guardianship of Evelyn Thorne to the county of Cook, Illinois, dated February 28, 2001. 1 week after David's 26th birthday, the day he had received full access to his trust fund. It wasn't an accident, it was a transaction. His father had declared his wife incompetent, signed her away like an underperforming asset, and pocketed the money that should have been used for her care. The fire was a cover story, a clean, dramatic end that prevented questions. David felt a nausea so profound he had to steady himself against the wall. His mother's hand tightened on his. She was looking at him, and in her clouded eyes he saw a lucid, terrifying awareness. She knew, she had always known, and she had been waiting. The next 48 hours were a blur of grim, methodical action. David moved his mother out of St. Francis that afternoon. He didn't ask permission. He simply lifted her from the wheelchair, wrapped her in his cashmere overcoat, and carried her out past a sputtering Sister Agnes. He installed her in the best suite at the city's most exclusive private hospital, hiring a round-the-clock nursing team specializing in geriatric trauma and neglect recovery. His lawyers descended on St. Francis and the county records office like a swarm. What they uncovered was not just a personal betrayal, but a systemic rot. St. Francis operated on a dark economy. They received state and county subsidies for housing indigent elderly, but those subsidies were meager. The real profit came from private pay patients like the ones David saw, and from a more sinister practice, serving as a silent, off-the-books repository for families who wanted a problematic relative to disappear. For a hefty one-time donation, the home would accept a person, falsify records to list them as a ward of the state, and provide only the minimal, life-sustaining care required to keep the checks coming. Sister Agnes, under threat of prosecution, broke. She gave them a ledger. Not a digital file, but an old, leather-bound book hidden in a safe behind a painting of the Virgin Mary. It listed names, dates, and payments. Evelyn Thorne's entry was there. A single payment of $250,000 received from a corporate entity called AT Holdings on March 1, 2001. AT Holdings was his father's shell company, the price tag for making a wife vanish. But Evelyn's entry was not alone. There were dozens. A retired judge with early-stage dementia, a wealthy socialite whose family wanted control of her estate. Each had a price, each had been erased. David's personal quest had stumbled into a graveyard of the deliberately forgotten. Meanwhile, Evelyn began to speak. The drugs that had kept her placid and non-communicative were flushed from her system. With patient, gentle therapy, words returned, fragmented at first. Names, places, fears. She remembered the arguments with Arthur. She remembered his fury when she threatened to expose his embezzlement from their shared business to fund his mistress's lifestyle. She remembered the men who came to the house one night, not firefighters, men in uniforms that looked official but weren't. They told her she was sick, that she was a danger to herself. They took her to a different facility first, a grim private clinic. She was there for months, heavily medicated. Then when the legal paperwork was complete, she was transferred to St. Francis. He told David I was dead, she whispered one afternoon, her voice gaining strength. He said it would be cleaner, a clean break for everyone. The scale of the cruelty was breathtaking, but David's father, Arthur, was beyond reach. He had died of a heart attack 5 years earlier, a man who had carried his secret to the grave, leaving his son a fortune built, in part, on his mother's imprisonment. David stood in his penthouse, looking at the city lights, holding the leather-bound ledger. He had the evidence to blow St. Francis apart, to expose the doctors, the lawyers, the county officials who had looked the other way for a fee. He could become a crusader. He could use his wealth and fury to tear the whole corrupt system down. But then his phone rang. It was his corporate lawyer, not his family attorney. His voice was tight. "David, we have a problem. A major investor just pulled out." They cited potential reputational damage from personal family matters. The blogosphere is starting to whisper, "Tycoon's mother found in orphanage." They're spinning it as a story about you neglecting her. The board is getting nervous. The trap was closing from a different direction. The world wasn't seeing a victim and a hero. It was seeing a scandal. And in the chaos, the real perpetrators, the still living doctors, the corrupt officials, the system itself, could easily slip back into the shadows. David's quest for justice was about to cost him everything he had built, and that's when he realized the final, brutal truth. His father hadn't just hidden his mother, he had designed a prison with no warden, a crime where the only person left to blame was the son who had been lied to. David had to make a choice, save his company and his reputation, or burn it all down to get the truth. He looked at the ledger in his hand, then at a photograph on his desk, a recent picture of his mother, finally sleeping peacefully in a sun-filled hospital room. He knew what she would want him to do, but as he reached for the phone to call a press conference, a new email alert flashed on his computer. The sender was anonymous. The subject line, "You have the ledger, but you don't know what it really means." The message contained a single, chilling attachment. A scanned document from the county coroner's office, dated 1999. It was a death certificate for Evelyn Thorne, cause of death, smoke inhalation, signed by Dr. Robert Vance. It was perfect. It was official. And according to this document, the woman currently recovering in the hospital suite did not exist. Someone had just proven they could make her disappear all over again. David stared at the death certificate on his screen, the state seal gleaming in digital perfection. It was a masterstroke. With this document, anyone who tried to help Evelyn Thorne would be committing fraud. Any hospital treating her could be accused of billing for a ghost. Legally, she was already dead. The anonymous email was not a threat. It was a demonstration of power, a way of saying, "We can bury her again with a keystroke." David's first instinct was rage. His second was cold, calculated fear. He forwarded the email and attachment to his most trusted cybersecurity consultant with 2 words, "Trace this." Then he called his mother's hospital suite. The head nurse answered, her voice calm. Evelyn was resting, comfortable, unaware of the legal ghost haunting her. David instructed them to increase security, to admit no one without his personal verification. He felt the walls of his world, once so solid, turning to vapor. The next morning, the trace came back. The email had been routed through a series of encrypted servers, a dead end. But the consultant found something else, a digital fingerprint buried in the metadata of the scanned death certificate. It came from a document scanner registered to the Cook County Clerk's Office, Archive Division. Someone with access to the official records had sent it. This wasn't just a family secret. This was institutional. David knew he couldn't fight this alone in the shadows. He needed daylight. He called a reporter, not from a tabloid, but from a respected investigative outlet that had broken nursing home scandals before. He offered her the ledger, the admission forms, the power of attorney, and his story. On one condition, she had to move fast before the forces arrayed against him could pressure her editors. The story broke online at 6 a.m. 3 days later. The headline was brutal: "The Orphanage of the Forgotten, How the Wealthy Make Family Disappear." It named St. Francis. It named AT Holdings. It quoted from the ledger, and it featured a photo, taken with David's permission, of Evelyn's hand holding his in her hospital bed, her wedding band still on her finger. The reaction was a tidal wave. St. Francis was shuttered by state regulators by noon. Sister Agnes was taken into custody for questioning. Families across the country, seeing the story, began calling news hotlines, wondering if their own lost relatives might be in similar care facilities. David's phone rang incessantly, more reporters, lawyers representing other families, even a state senator demanding a committee hearing. But the counterattack from his corporate world was swift and brutal. By 10 a.m., his company's stock had plunged 12%. The board demanded an emergency meeting. His lawyer called, his voice strained. "David, they're citing the clause about personal conduct bringing the company into disrepute. They're building a case to vote you out as CEO. The investors are panicking. They see you as a loose cannon, a liability." He was being forced to choose, just as the anonymous sender intended, his mother or his empire. He drove to the corporate headquarters, a glass tower that had been his monument to success. The boardroom was cold. The faces around the table, men and women he had made wealthy, were now masks of polite hostility. They presented their ultimatum: step down temporarily, issue a statement expressing regret for the public distraction, and allow a crisis management firm to reshape the narrative. In return, they would protect his shares and his position as chairman. It was a velvet-gloved coup. David looked out the window at the city. Somewhere in it, his mother was learning to walk again with a physical therapist. He thought of the ledger, of the other names, the other families. He stood up. "My mother was imprisoned for 20 years by a system you all benefit from, a system of silence and money. I will not be silent. Do what you have to do." He walked out, leaving his empire behind. That afternoon, in a small conference room at his lawyer's office, he met the whistleblower. She had contacted the reporter, offering to talk only to David. Her name was Anya. She was in her late 40s, with tired eyes and a nervous grip on her coffee cup. For 15 years, she had been a senior clerk in the county's Adult Protective Services archives. "I processed the Thorne file," she said quietly. "The original one in 2001. It raised red flags. A woman with no prior medical history, declared incompetent by a single doctor, with a wealthy husband paying for a private transfer. But my supervisor told me to file it and forget it." He said the Dr. Vance had powerful friends. She took a shuddering breath. "Then last year I was archiving old coroner cases. I found the death certificate for Evelyn Thorne. It was filed, but it was wrong. The case number didn't match the coroner's log for that day. The signature was real, but the form was a different version than the county used in '99. It was a fake, created after the fact and slipped into the archive, I think. I think when your father died 5 years ago, someone needed to tidy up the loose end, to make the paper trail perfect in case anyone ever looked." David felt the room tilt. "Who?" Anya shook her head. "I don't know, but it had to be someone with access to both the coroner's blank forms and the archive, someone who knew the original crime. When your story broke, I knew I had to come forward, because it's not just your mother, it's a pipeline. Dr. Vance would declare them unfit. A judge in his pocket would approve the guardianship transfer. The county would place them in facilities like St. Francis for a kickback, and the families would pay a premium for the silence." She slid a USB drive across the table. "This is a list. Case numbers, dates, doctors' names, judges' initials. I've been copying them for a year, too scared to do anything. There are at least 30 cases that follow the same pattern." David inserted the drive into his laptop. A spreadsheet opened. Line after line of names, dates, dollar amounts. It was a map of a silent atrocity. At that moment, his personal crusade ended and a larger war began. He wasn't just fighting for his mother anymore. He was holding evidence of a criminal enterprise that preyed on the vulnerable. He called the reporter back and gave her the USB drive. The second story exploded with the force of a bomb. It named Dr. Robert Vance. It named a retired family court judge. It named officials in the county welfare department. By the end of the day, the district attorney had announced a grand jury investigation. David was no longer a scandalous CEO. He was the key witness. The fallout was immediate and vicious. Dr. Vance's lawyer issued a statement calling the allegations libelous fiction and threatening to sue. The retired judge gave a tearful interview, claiming he was being persecuted for the difficult decisions of his career. But the public tide had turned. David's willingness to lose his company gave his testimony a moral weight that money couldn't buy. He moved his mother to a secluded, secure rehabilitation center out of state. Her recovery, now free from legal shadows, accelerated. She began to speak in full sentences, to ask about his life, to remember the son she thought had abandoned her. The reconciliation was fragile, beautiful, and achingly painful. Then, a week after the grand jury was convened, David received a registered letter. It was from the law firm representing his former company's board. They were suing him for breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of corporate resources, claiming his personal crusade had damaged shareholder value. The lawsuit sought damages in the tens of millions. It was a final financial attempt to break him. As he read the legalese, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered. A man's voice, calm and elderly, spoke. "Mr. Thorne, you have been very busy stirring up hornets. You have the ledger, you have the list, but you are still asking the wrong question." David froze. "Who is this?" "The right question," the voice continued, ignoring him, "is not who put her in there. Anyone with money and a problem could do that. The right question is, why did they keep her alive for 20 years? The line went dead. David stood in the silence of his emptying penthouse, the lawsuit forgotten. The man's words echoed. Why keep her alive? It was the one piece that didn't fit. If his father wanted her gone, why not just make her gone? The $250,000 payment was a lot for simple storage. Unless she was worth more alive, unless she was collateral. He thought of the shell companies, the embezzlement his mother had discovered. What if she knew more? What if her silence wasn't just about hiding a shameful secret, but about protecting a much larger ongoing crime? The anonymous caller was right. He had been looking backward at the crime of her abandonment. He needed to look forward at the reason for her preservation. The mystery had just deepened, and the stakes had skyrocketed. Someone wasn't just trying to bury the past. They were terrified of what his mother might remember about the future. The question hung in the air, a toxic fog that changed everything. Why keep her alive? David drove through the night to the secluded rehabilitation center where his mother was recovering. The peaceful facility felt like a lie now. He sat with her as dawn broke, holding her hand, watching her sleep. When she woke, her eyes were clearer than he'd ever seen them. "David," she said, her voice steady, "we need to talk about the safe." He hadn't heard her use that tone in 20 years. It was the voice of the woman who had run a household, who had balanced the books for his father's early business. "What safe, Mom?" "In the old house, the study, your father had a wall safe behind the Monet reproduction. He thought I didn't know the combination." She recited a series of numbers, a date, their wedding anniversary, a bitter irony. "He put things in there, things he said were his insurance. After I threatened to go to the authorities about the money he was moving, he laughed. He said if anything ever happened to him, the contents of that safe would be my inheritance. My pension, he called it." The old house had been sold years ago after his father's death. David tracked down the current owner, a young family, and offered them triple the market value to let him in for 1 hour with a locksmith. The Monet print was long gone, replaced by a child's finger painting, but the safe was still there, embedded in the concrete wall. The locksmith opened it. Inside were not stacks of cash or jewels, but documents, a faded leather-bound journal, and a single unlabeled VHS tape. David took them to a secure office. The journal was his father's, page after page of coded entries, but also names, account numbers, and amounts. It wasn't just embezzlement from his own company. Arthur Thorne had been a silent partner in a massive Medicare and Medicaid fraud scheme. Dr. Vance wasn't just a corrupt physician, he was a franchisee. He would prescribe unnecessary, expensive procedures and equipment for patients in nursing homes St. Francis controlled. Phantom treatments for real people. The kickbacks flowed through a network of shell companies, one of which was AT Holdings. The ledger David had was just the tip of the iceberg. This journal was the iceberg itself. Evelyn Thorne had discovered the journal. That was the secret worth imprisoning her for. She wasn't just an inconvenient wife. She was a witness to a multi-million-dollar ongoing federal crime. Killing her would have drawn attention, especially if she had told someone else. But declaring her insane and hiding her in plain sight, that was perfect. She was silenced, and she became a living piece of collateral. If Arthur ever went down, he could threaten to produce his insane wife, who would corroborate the fraud, muddying the waters, or he could use her safety as a bargaining chip. But Arthur died suddenly. The people left running the scheme, Vance and others, were left with a problem, a living witness in a ledger-funded nursing home. They kept paying St. Francis to keep her quiet, maintaining the status quo. The fake death certificate was their attempt, after Arthur's death, to finally sever the loose end legally, to make her disappear on paper in case anyone like David ever came looking. David held the journal, the weight of its truth immense. This was no longer a family drama, it was a federal case. He called the investigator from the district attorney's office and handed over everything. The journal, the tape, his analysis. The tape, when played, showed his father and Dr. Vance in a restaurant booth, casually discussing patient numbers and profit splits. It was incontrovertible. The dominoes fell fast and hard. Dr. Robert Vance was arrested at his golf club on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. The retired judge was indicted for bribery. 3 county officials resigned and were charged. The lawsuit from David's former board evaporated the moment the U.S. Attorney's Office announced David was a key cooperating witness in a major federal investigation. His corporate enemies backed away, terrified of being associated with the scandal. With the legal machinery grinding forward, David finally had space to breathe. He focused entirely on his mother. Her physical and mental recovery, now free from the shadow of the secret, was remarkable. She moved into a graceful, accessible cottage on the grounds of his estate. She planted a garden. She started painting again. One afternoon, she looked at him and said, "I never blamed you, David. I thought he'd turned you against me. I thought you believed I was dead because you wanted to." He broke down then, releasing 2 decades of guilt he hadn't even fully acknowledged. Their healing was a slow, deliberate process. He learned about the 20 years, the small kindnesses from a few aides, the endless, silent days, the way she held onto his childhood photo as an act of defiance. She learned about his life, the driven, lonely man he'd become, the empire built on a foundation of grief. And what of his quest to adopt? In the aftermath, he contacted social services. He didn't want to pursue a private adoption. He used his remaining wealth to establish a foundation dedicated to reforming elder care and supporting children aging out of the foster system. He named it the Evelyn Foundation. Leo, the quiet boy from St. Francis, was placed with a loving foster family, his fees and education funded by the foundation. David and Evelyn visit him often. He calls her Grandma Evie. The final surprise came from the journal's last page. It wasn't written by Arthur. It was a note in a different hand dated just a month before Arthur's fatal heart attack. It read, "Arthur, the partners are nervous. The Evelyn problem is a liability, not an asset. The facility is too visible. We are arranging a permanent transfer, a closed facility out of state. Do not interfere. RV." Dr. Vance wasn't just planning to keep her quiet. In the end, he was planning to make the problem disappear forever. David's arrival at St. Francis, his naive quest to adopt a child, had literally pulled his mother from the edge of a cliff she never knew was there. The system that allowed this was not dismantled overnight, but the case became a landmark. New laws were proposed, bearing Evelyn's name, requiring stricter audits of mixed care facilities, and creating a centralized registry for guardianship transfers. The story of the wealthy man who found his mother in an orphanage became a catalyst for change, a stark reminder that the most vulnerable are often hidden not in shadows, but in plain sight, in places we are taught not to see. David Thorne never regained his CEO title, and he didn't want it. He found a different kind of wealth. On his mother's 78th birthday, they sat in her garden. She was walking with a cane now, her laughter easy. She pointed to a thriving lavender plant. "It's finally taken root," she said. He knew she wasn't just talking about the flowers. The journey that began with a transaction, a check written to fill a void, ended with a truth that no amount of money could ever buy. He went looking for a child to save him from his past, and instead he found the past itself, waiting to save him from his future. The mystery was solved, the criminals were facing justice, but the real payoff was far simpler and far more profound. It was a second chance. It was the sound of his mother laughing in the sunlight. It was coming home. David Thorne's story is not an anomaly. It is a spotlight on a hidden world. The term granny dumping entered our lexicon decades ago, but the reality it describes has only grown more sophisticated. It is no longer just about leaving someone at a hospital door. It is about using legal frameworks as weapons, about turning care facilities into silent prisons, and about leveraging wealth and influence to make a human being disappear from the record of the living. An estimated 1 in 6 older adults experiences some form of abuse each year. For the 22% who are elder orphans, with no family to advocate for them, the risk is catastrophic. They become invisible not through accident but through design. The system David uncovered, where doctors, judges, and administrators greased the wheels of abandonment, thrives in the gap between our compassion and our attention. We look away because it is painful. We look away because it is complex. And in that space, a multi-billion-dollar industry can operate in plain sight, trading in human dignity. But David's story and Evelyn's survival proves that the most powerful force against that darkness is not a law or a ledger or a fortune. It is a single stubborn question: who is missing? It is the willingness to look into the forgotten wing, to question the tidy story, to recognize that a person is not a problem to be solved, but a history to be honored. Their journey from a dusty sunroom to a sunlit garden is a map for redemption. It tells us that it is never too late to seek the truth, and it is never too late to come home. The miracles we need are often waiting in the places we've been taught not to see. All we have to do is look. If this story moved you, share it. Someone in your life might need to hear it. And subscribe for more documentaries that look closer at the world hidden in plain sight. Until next time.